The sun has gone down at Hangman's Hill, and the ghost at Misery Corner isn't walking tonight. So, welcome to the Weird Tales radio show, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, witchcraft, magic and folklore. And now, here's your host, writer, award-winning journalist, best-selling author, and sometime werewolf hunter, Charles Christian.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Weird Tales radio show with me, Charles Christian. Thank you for tuning in again for more weird tales in weird times. In this week's show, we are back with Dr. Richard Spence for the second part of our discussion about the espionage life and times of Aleister Crowley. Was he really a precursor of James Bond? Secret Agent 666. But before we go there, here are some news items you may have missed over the last few days. The Regent Theatre in Picton, Canada, recently held a fundraiser to keep the place going. Like a lot of live venues, it's struggling to survive because of the COVID-19 lockdown and social distancing rules now in force. So, to coincide with Halloween, they held an auction in which people could bid to become the theatre's official ghost. Obviously, after they died, the auction raised just over 4,000 Canadian dollars, and the winner was Ryan Aldred of Picton. The Regent Theatre is apparently one of the few older theatres that doesn't have a resident ghost. And now it's over to Kent in England and the village of Duncan Down near Whitstable, where a new stone circle has just been discovered on the village green. It has a central altar stone and 8 outer megaliths pointing towards the 4 compass points and the sunrise and sunset points for the winter and summer solstices. So how come, you ask, it's only just been discovered? And how did the people of that era move and erect the stones? Well, actually it was erected just 2 weeks ago as part of a new nature reserve project, and they used a JCB digger or backhoe tractor. Now, we have a haunted house for sale. It's Loftus Hall in Wexford, that's on Ireland's Hook Peninsula. It dates back to the 14th century and is said to be Ireland's most haunted house. The most dramatic legend is that of the young Lady Anne Tottenham, who fell in love with a handsome stranger who arrived at the hall one stormy night seeking shelter. All went well until one evening, during a game of cards, Lady Anne dropped a card on the floor, and when she leant over to retrieve it, she noticed the handsome stranger had cloven hooves. It was the devil himself. Realising he'd been rumbled, he shot up through the roof in a ball of flames and was never seen again. As for Lady Anne, the shock drove her quite mad, and she spent the rest of her life locked in the hall's tapestry room. Not surprisingly, her ghost is said to still haunt the hall. Anyway, the hall is up for sale for 2.5 million euros. That's about 3 million US dollars. And for that you get 22 bedrooms, 97 windows and 63 acres of land, as well as numerous unearthly sitting tenants. Be warned, the house, which has recently been used as a hotel, is semi-derelict in some parts, but prior to the COVID-19 lockdown, it was a popular destination for ghost hunters. If you check out the WeirdTalesRadio.com website, you'll find a video link to this story. Now back to the second part of our interview with Dr. Richard Spence, who is a professor of history at the University of Idaho. He specialises in Russian intelligence and military history, and his university courses include offerings on modern espionage, the history of secret societies, and the occult in history. He's appeared on various History Channel documentaries and is a consultant to the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. His books include Trust No One, The Secret World of Sidney Riley, and Secret Agent 666, Aleister Crowley, British Intelligence and the Occult. At the end of last week's show, we'd reached the start of World War II, when British intelligence agencies were still making use of Crowley's skills and connections, including all those wacko Nazis he'd met in pre-war Berlin, even employing some of his magical rituals as a basis for interrogating Rudolf Hess, whose motivation for his strange flight to Scotland still remains a mystery today. And just to bring matters up to date, we also touch upon American rocket and nuclear bomb tech pioneer Jack Parsons, a disciple of Aleister Crowley. Parsons, who may have been a Soviet spy, was subsequently investigated by Church of Scientology founder and sci-fi writer L. Ron Hubbard, who at that time worked for American intelligence. Is that word enough for you? In case it's not, Parsons subsequently blew himself up in a mysterious explosion, which may have been accidental or it may have been an assassination.
I mean, here again, I would simply point these things. Crowley, on his own initiative apparently, experimented with the effects of mescaline, and he had done so apparently for years. Mescaline then was used in the Second World War to some degree as an aid in interrogation, and Rudolf Hess, who was interrogated, claimed, maybe he was delusional, maybe he wasn't, that it was being used on him. And Crowley, at the beginning of World War II, is asked to contact an officer in naval intelligence who is involved in prisoner interrogations.
Mm-hmm.
Now, those could well be all isolated incidents, coincidences that have nothing to do with one another, or they could be a pattern.
Yeah.
That doesn't tell you the details of what's going on, but it does give you it gives you some sort of sense that Crowley was, based upon what? Here again, the question is, can this guy be useful? And if he can be useful, well, let's bring him in. Let him have a try at it. Why not?
When Crowley was in Berlin in the early 30s, which, as you say, was a very interesting period, and go check out the movie Cabaret to get an idea of.
There you go.
The aspects
or Babylon Berlin. This is a German television series based on some books, which shows up. That I would highly recommend.
Right. Yeah. Now, we all know that the Nazis, some of them, had an obsession with the occult and some quite wacky ideas. Now, is there any evidence that Crowley was in touch with Nazi occultists in the early 30s?
Okay, well, you just hit upon another one of the things that almost always frequently crops up as one of the Crowley myths, which, goes that he was in some way, the most extreme version is that Crowley was an actual mentor to Adolf Hitler. Well, actually, probably the most extreme version is that he was Adolf Hitler, which I would attempt to explain. But that somehow Crowley was introduced to, the future Führer, and then he sort of trained him in occult techniques or even in public speaking. And I haven't found anything to suggest that they were ever, they weren't in the same room together. I'm not even sure they were even in the same, section of town together at any time.
Yeah.
No, there's nothing that seems to suggest that Crowley, he did send, I think, a copy of, Crowley's, I guess, his Bible, so to speak, the Book of the Law. He wanted to try to get it, into Hitler's hands. But he also had somebody send one to Stalin. Okay, and neither one of those seem to have been particularly successful. I can't see any evidence that Adolf Hitler even knew who Aleister Crowley was.
Yeah,
but here's the interesting thing about this is that Crowley was in Berlin during the whole Depression, the decline of the Weimar Republic, the rise of the Nazis, which really begins from 1930 to 1932. So he's there. He has a front row seat for this. And the thing that he is then later accused of is having been involved in some direct connection with the Nazis and with Hitler personally, and to have become some kind of mentor to Hitler. Mm-hmm. Now, Crowley didn't do that, but there was someone who did fit that bill, who's there at the same time. And that's a fairly obscure character by the name of Erik Jan Hanussen. And there are a couple of books out there about him. I think there's actually a couple of movies. One of them is called Mephisto, which was, probably some years back. But Hanussen has sort of faded into obscurity, which he really doesn't deserve because he's an interesting character. Hanussen was a German psychic. I guess that's what we would call him today, clairvoyant.
Yeah.
Well, that's what he claimed to be. And he had built up a career, mostly in Germany during the 20s, as a kind of stage magician. He put on a great act. He was a mind reader. He branched out into astrology and to other areas of he became a kind of, one shop, stop occult store for everything. And he became a celebrity. So the thing to keep in mind is that in Berlin in 1931, 1932, one of the biggest names in town, the hot ticket, was Hanussen. And just about anyone who was anyone would go to his shows. This was a big, so he had a couple of popular newspapers, one of them built entirely with astrological predictions. And so what Hanussen started doing, for whatever reason Hanussen did things, was that he made great predictions about the Nazis and Hitler and he predicted that Hitler would become Chancellor of Germany, and that the Nazi Party would win majority status in the Reichstag, and these things happened.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to attempt to explain why they happened. Whether Hanussen was actually could read the stars or was just a lucky guesser.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, it happened, and that, of course, made people in the Nazi hierarchy very interested in him. And so he actually was introduced to Hitler, and he did, briefly in the period sort of during most of 1932, early 1933, was briefly, at least on the fringes of the hierarchy, and actually met Hitler and did give him some advice. Okay. Nevertheless, the main thing he seems to have done was to constantly reassure Hitler that yes, the stars say this will happen, it will happen, because apparently Adolf could become insecure at times, and begin to feel that things were going against him. And so Hanussen did have so. What I think happened is this. Okay, this is one of these things you can often again see in historical situations, is that people and events bleed into each other.
Mm-hmm.
People who have slightly similar roles can become confused with one another. So in essence, I think this whole business, this whole myth that Crowley was connected to the Nazis and Hitler is a case of mistaken identity.
Right.
That as awareness of Hanussen faded away, as people basically never knew or forgot who Hanussen was, but there was still this kind of residual memory of what Hanussen had done. It became connected to the other person you could place there that seemed to fit it, which was Crowley.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, basically, if you look at all the stuff that Crowley gets accused of doing, it's the stuff that Hanussen was doing. But Crowley, we still remember, he will become eventually more and more, people will become more and more aware of him, whereas the awareness of Hanussen fades away. So that I think is the solution to it.
Yeah, yeah.
That still leaves an interesting question, though. Crowley's in Berlin while Hanussen is at the height of his fame. When Hanussen actually does make this entree into the Nazi hierarchy. And how much was he aware of that? And since Crowley was there in Berlin to observe and report, what did he observe and to me, he had to have been aware of that. Because one, Crowley was fascinated with things. He was very knowledgeable about stage magic. Remember, his previous connection to this Society for Psychical Research was largely focused on that.
Yeah.
And by the way, Crowley tended to think that most mediums and stage psychics were fakes.
Yeah.
All right. He detested mediums for the most part because that's what he thought. He either thought they were fakes or they thought they were people who were dealing with low spirits. But either way, no one that he would apparently invite over for a mescaline
Yes.
lace dinner. Not going to be invited to dinner at Aleister Crowley's house. So I can't believe that Crowley was there as a experienced observer, noting these things going on, that he wouldn't have picked up on Hanason, and that he wouldn't have picked up on Hanason's rather public, connections with the Nazi. I mean, none of this is being hidden.
Yeah.
So one of the interesting things to do, the main incarnation of the OTO today, the one that's headquartered in the U.S., the Caliphate OTO, as it calls itself.
Yeah.
One of the things that it has is that they have most of Crowley's diaries, and so he's kept a diary which would record his magical exploits, but would record pretty much everything else. The frustrating thing about these diaries is that Crowley often talks about people. He gives them sort of code names. That sounds kind of spyish, or something that only he would know who he was talking about. So sometimes he'll name people openly. In other cases, it's just some sort of personal gobbledygook that only makes sense to him. So the one thing that I could ask a favor to go through these, is there any reference in here to Hanason? Anything was that? Nothing. Okay, couldn't find anything that would refer to him. So that's a dry hole, so to speak. There's nothing there. Although I could, in semi-desperation, make the argument that Hanason's name in this sense is conspicuous by its absence.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, here again,
yeah.
Hanason was, a very prominent public figure. His performances are still very much the talk of the town. There isn't any way Crowley would have been aware of them. He would almost certainly have tried to take them in, if nothing else, for his own entertainment. So why wouldn't he mention them? Why wouldn't that name come up in some way? So that to me is still one of these, that is an unexplored episode that I think ultimately there is much more to be learned about, and I think he did have some awareness of that, but I'd really like to be able to find out more about that.
And later on in World War II, obviously we are then getting closer and closer to Crowley's own death, but later on in World War II, did he have any involvement with the security services other than the fact that they kept his heroin coming and a roof over his head?
There was some talk about, one of the few places he had any real followers at that point was in the States.
Mm-hmm.
And so Crowley had, again, through a complicated set of personal involvement, had essentially proclaimed himself head of the OTO. So remember that thing that had originally been a German secret society. Yes. In the early 1920s, he essentially just usurped leadership of most of it, which some people accepted and others didn't. And that's how that then became connected to him. And there were different lodges of this, and I think there were only a few lodges that were still functioning by, let's say, by 1945. And one of them was a thing called the Agape Lodge, which was in Pasadena, California.
Mm-hmm.
And that had come up sometime, I think, in the late 1930s, and it was still kind of barely hanging on. But that sort of brings in Crowley in connection to another sort of infamous character by the name of John Whiteside Parsons.
Mm-hmm.
Who I don't know is terribly well known.
Is this also Jack Parsons, or is that a different...
Jack Parsons, yes. John Whiteside Parsons.
Right.
Whose real name, by the way, was Marvel Parsons. So anyway, he changed that. So yes, John Whiteside Parsons, a.k.a. Jack Parsons, is one of those guys he really is one of the kind of, fathers of the American space program. He's got a crater on the moon, on the dark side of the moon, named after him. And he was a rocket scientist, / occultist. All right.
Right.
So if you want to understand Jack Parsons, you've got to imagine him out in a gully somewhere on the edge of Los Angeles sending up an experimental rocket that might blow up in his face and kill everyone. And in order to ensure that didn't happen, he would dance around before it was ignited and recite Crowley's Hymn to Pan.
Well, that probably works, yes.
Well, he didn't get killed then. So, but that's what some of his engineers, some of the more scientific types around him would think, is that, well, Jack might be crazy, but it did kind of seem to work. So here again, it's one of these things that it just sort of combines together in one person. So Parsons, during the 1940s, had developed an interest in occult. He had joined the OTO. He joined the Agape Lodge. He became the head of it, and he began a short-lived but lively correspondence with the man he saw as his spiritual mentor, Aleister Crowley, who, meantime, is back living in genteel poverty, dying. Crowley, again, doesn't have a lot of followers by this time, and initially he's, very, he thinks there might be something to this Parsons guy. He eventually comes to the conclusion, as he did with, most of his followers, that, Parsons was kind of an overzealous idiot. he loses faith in him. He doesn't think that he's going as far as he might, and part of that reason was that. Is that Parsons became involved in carrying out magical workings out in the deserts to the east of Los Angeles, a thing called the Babylon working, which was based again upon Crowley's own sort of rituals, but he was doing it with a guy who also became even more famous than Parsons, L. Ron Hubbard.
Oh, right.
Yeah, so Parsons and L. when they were buddies, which didn't last that long, but when they were friends, they were out in the desert practicing Crowleyan rituals to try to incarnate the goddess Babylon. And the only thing I can say about that is that it turned out badly for Parsons. On the other hand, not so bad for Hubbard.
Yes.
And and by the way, Hubbard would later explain all of this by saying that he was actually spying on Parsons for U.S. naval intelligence.
Because wasn't there a suggestion that Parsons was, in fact, a Soviet spy?
Well, yes. Now, remember what I said earlier about how occultism and intelligence keep, sort of interpollinating with each other? If I was in charge of security and I looked at Jack Parsons, I would never give him a security clearance in that period. In fact, he lost 2 security clearances. Well, I mean, look, you lose 1 security clearance and then you appeal and you get it restored, and then you get another high security job, and then you admit that you took classified papers from Hughes Aircraft, you gave them to someone to type up so that you could send them overseas, maybe to Israel, maybe who knows where, in order to get a job. Okay, would you hire that for? Okay, would you want to understand why Jack Parsons lost his security clearance the second time forever? Okay, for that type of thing. So, but there are reasons to suspect that. Parsons was, had actually belonged to the Communist Party about 1939. He was a member of a kind of professional group at Caltech, which was essentially organized and run by 2 people connected to Soviet intelligence. He then had a kind of, ran a kind of crash pad in Pasadena, at his mansion in Pasadena, where he had people who were, well, here's a good case. He had a fellow by the name of Robert Cornog, who was staying at his place, and Robert Cornog worked at Los Alamos on the Manhattan Project on the atomic bomb trigger.
Mm-hmm.
And so, while he was staying at Parsons' place, Parsons would, carry out magical rituals, have sort of, I guess you could call them orgies.
Yep.
and Cornog and other engineers would be invited to it. And I'm not sure Cornog gave anything away, but you could, let's put it this way. On the other hand, if I was a Soviet intelligence officer, would Jack Parsons be a useful asset?
Mm-hmm.
You bet he would be. Okay, this guy worked. I mean, look, he worked on rocket and engine projects for the U.S. military. All right, he had connections in Washington. He had connections with people at Los Alamos. He designed. Parsons' big contribution was basically him with solid fuel rocket engines.
Yeah.
And so, this would have been someone that they were after. And if nobody tried to recruit him, then somebody in the KGB wasn't doing their job. Okay. And you know what happens to people in the KGB that don't do their jobs.
Yes.
So someone almost certainly tried, and then you catch him stealing stuff. So I've got to think that might well have been the case. So here again, whatever else you think of L. Ron Hubbard, when he says that essentially naval intelligence sent him in to check up on Parsons, who they thought might actually be trying to collect intelligence for opposing forces, he may have been telling the truth in the same way that Crowley was telling the truth about working for His Majesty's government in America during World War I.
You're listening to the Weird Tales radio show with Charles Christian.
What happened to Parsons, ultimately?
He blew himself up.
With his rockets, or...
Well, let's put it this way. He died in an explosion in his home laboratory.
Right.
So Parsons, keep in mind, really wasn't a trained scientist. He was just this kind of brilliant amateur. In terms of being able to handle explosives.
Mm-hmm.
So he spent much of his life around explosives. He was, Parsons was one of those people you could say was a kind of genius in the sense that what many geniuses can do is that they can visualize things that don't exist.
Yeah.
That is, you can and think of this, that Parsons in a sense could visualize the existence of a stable, solid fuel rocket engine when no one had yet been able to create one.
Yeah.
And he was able to visualize that and eventually come up with it. But it was something really that he sort of formed this picture of, and then he carried out all of these experiments to eventually bring it, which, if you think about it, is a very sort of occulty sort of thing to do, isn't it?
Mm.
If you think that the sort of power of visualization,
yes,
you still get this today and all of this, mindfulness stuff.
Mm.
You visualize success and it will appear. Visualize what you want and you can bring it into being. And that, again, that is a key element, you might say, in everything from ritual magic and just in kind of everyday innovation. I really could argue throughout history what's made people, the great inventions come from people who can just imagine something that doesn't exist and try to bring that in.
Yeah.
So Parsons was this kind of so when he's called a rocket scientist, you could quibble and say, well, he doesn't hold a scientific degree, but nonetheless, he made certainly scientific or technological leaps. But in Parsons' mind, there was no separation from the realm of the occult and the realm of science. To him, they were simply the same type of thing, and that's what drew him to Crowley. Again, Crowley became thinking that he might be the guy who could kind of, Parsons very much wanted to be Aleister Crowley's heir.
Yeah.
He wanted to be, in some way, I think, his kind of adoptive son, and that didn't really work out. No, he was, the argument against him accidentally killing himself with explosives is that he had spent his life working with highly volatile chemicals and he had avoided blowing himself up to that point in time.
Yes.
So why would he make an amateur mistake?
Yes.
And drop something? Well, true, that's an interesting question. On the other hand, some days things go wrong.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
He had like a can of fulminate of mercury, and it slips out of your hands. It's just so. Overwhelmingly, I think the evidence is that Parsons' death was accidental.
Yeah.
Although it was timely.
Hmm.
Because if you think about the fact that he had lost his second security clearance, he was never going to work on a classified project in the United States again. He was poisoned.
Hmm.
And he was already saying that what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my lab, and I'm going to take all of the notes I have, and I'm going to go abroad.
Hmm.
And he was telling people that he was going to take a job in Israel, which may have been true. But of course, what that meant was that he was planning to go from the U.S. to Mexico, and then from Mexico to Europe or to the Middle East. And he could have gone to Tel Aviv, or he could have been headed for Moscow.
Mm-hmm.
And it's when he's essentially packing up to leave that the explosion takes place.
Yeah.
So that's one of those things that could I completely reject the possibility that he was murdered? No, I don't think it's likely. But, the timing is interesting. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, it was very convenient.
It's very convenient.
Yeah.
Okay. It's very convenient from the fact that now you don't have to worry about this guy going anywhere and revealing any.
Yep.
Parsons is a talented inventor who could do all kinds of interesting things. And now he wasn't going to be doing that for anybody else. So, just one of those things to keep in mind.
Is it true that he arrived in America on the Lusitania on Halloween?
Yes, absolutely.
Wonderful.
Now, the question is, did he plan it that way? See, here you go.
Yeah, right.
What are the odds that Aleister Crowley sails into New York on a ship that, it's still very much afloat, but is doomed, as we now know, on Halloween? I don't see how he could, he didn't control the shipping schedules. It's probably one of those things that, to all outward appearances, is just a kind of weird coincidence. But then, is there any such thing as coincidence?
Yeah.
Think of it this way. Did Aleister Crowley make that happen? Or did the unseen forces that control everything make that happen? Who knows?
That's wonderful. Well, Richard, it's been brilliant talking to you. I will give a mention to your books later. Are you planning any more work on Aleister Crowley, or this occult meets intelligence side of the equation?
Well, yeah, I'm always interested. Like I said with the Hunnison thing, I'm always looking for more material. And if I've accumulated a whole, collection of details that aren't in the book as it exists now. So if I ever get around to doing a second edition of that, and that's the one book I've written I probably would like to do a second edition of. I suppose I should get in a plug. There is an outfit in the States, which I'm sure is available in the UK, called The Great Courses. And The Great Courses offers, basically their traditional thing was they offered DVD courses. Now it's mostly online courses and all kinds of subjects. And one of the ones that I did for them last year was called The Real History of Secret Societies. Mm-hmm. And that has 24 episodes on all kinds of interesting, some well-known, some not so well-known things. And Crowley gets his mention in that, of course. He's going to come up into it. And Nazis and Jack Parsons and a whole variety of other things that come up in that regard. And I have sort of recently, I'm thinking about writing a book called Flying Saucers and Secret Agents. Now,
you've got the title there. I
Well, see, that's sometimes what you start with. Okay,
Yes.
you got to have a title for this, and what that has to do with, I will admit that the whole UFO thing is something that I have just completely ignored. Okay, I never wanted anything to do with that. Right, and even it's a very interesting subject, but it just wasn't any particular direction that I wanted to go, and again through really the sort of interest in Parsons, who would fit into this. One of the things I began to realize is that here again, there's this, if you look, in this sort of early period of what you would tend to think of as sort of, flying saucer culture, if you look at the sort of saucer cults that come up in the 1950s, they're all essentially based in occultism.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I mean, you've got, what people are doing, one of the figures I've been interested in is a fellow by the name of George Hunt Williamson, who wrote a whole series of books during the 50s and became a pretty big figure in that field. And how does he communicate with aliens? Well, he channels them starting with a Ouija board, and then he goes to automatic writing. All right? In other words, he does the same stuff that mediums and other occultists have been doing for millennia in order to communicate. So it's the same sort of techniques, okay? And then that's what I tended to see in this, is that they're just using the same sort of techniques, and they're just sort of recycling theosophy. The ascended masters now become the space brothers. And I don't really, I'm not trying to suggest that I think that the whole thing is, shall we say, BS. But it's not quite what it appears. Again, I'm always interested in the connections between these things and how it comes in. And then you also begin to find, as you begin to look around, there's the whole emphasis on espionage. There's an intelligence angle to this. So the simplest way to explain that would be to say that one of the things that the U.S. Air Force, and by the way, the CIA became interested in the whole saucer business in the 50s, was that there were these groups of people, out there who were constantly looking at things in the sky, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right? They're fascinated with things that are flying around. Well, and they collect information and they share information with each other. Well, some of the things they're looking at, to no great surprise, are classified military aircraft.
Mm-hmm.
Things like the U-2 reconnaissance plane, which was a big secret.
Yep.
And so now you've got these groups of overzealous saucer hunters who are constantly peering around, becoming acutely interested in things which they really shouldn't be that interested in, and sharing information. So one of the concerns is that how could Soviet intelligence exploit that? Well, what they could do is infiltrate their own people into these groups and collect their information and analyze it differently.
Mm.
All right.
Yep.
So, in other words, you've got Soviet operatives who aren't really interested in flying saucers. What they're interested in is whether these flying saucer hunters are coming up with details that could clue us in on other secret projects that are underway. Well, then the question becomes, well, how do we respond to that? Well, we infiltrate our own people into these groups to spy on the possible spies that are inside of them, and also to lead the groups away from anything important.
Mm.
And which is exactly, anyone out there who's ever familiar with something later on, I think in the 70s and 80s, called the Paul Benowitz case, is a classic example of the Air Force Office of Special Intelligence doing just that. Paul Benowitz was getting way too close to secret projects, and so they sent in to sell him this whole other alien story that eventually drove him completely out of his mind. So it's this, I guess this stuff that's kind of, fascinates me in so much of this, if you want to get down to it, is just that you come across these things where everything appears to be deception and everybody is lying about something. And what I want to figure out is where in the midst of all of this deception and lies, where's the truth? Mm-hmm. That's what I'm looking for.
Would that also, these US intelligence operations, be the source of the now notorious Men in Black concept?
Well, some people would say absolutely yes. Another ones would say, my suspicion is that yes, that's probably what it is in some form or another. Because there's a lot of this stuff going on. It is this constant degree of manipulation of material, and that's really what if I would keep that title, Flying Saucers and Secret Agents, I'm talking about. I wouldn't in that case be particularly interested in whether or not there were extraterrestrials, but in terms of how terrestrials are dealing with this. I think the most of the questions that I want to answer actually deal with probably much more in the intelligence realm than anything else.
That's fascinating.
And if Aleister Crowley was still alive, which of course would be impossible, he'd be in the middle of that somehow or another.
He would indeed. He'd probably be laughing.
He would.
He'd be laughing his head off as long as somebody kept sending him his packets of heroin.
Yeah. And see, that's the other thing that you have to appreciate about Crowley, is that the guy, for everything else, for all of the other things that were wrong with him, I do give him credit for having a wicked sense of humor.
Yes.
He was a man who could get a joke if he wanted to.
I think that was one of his failings, in the sense that he had a sense of humour that not everybody else quite appreciated, and they took him seriously.
Yes. Okay. I've had that happen to me. I can't. I mean, look, why would you think I was? Then you have to explain that this was a joke, and they just don't get it. I think that is the big problem with the entire world, is that people just don't get the joke, and we go from there.
I think that's a perfect line to end on. So,
okay.
Dr. Richard Spence, thank you ever so much indeed for your time. That has been brilliant.
Thank you for having me on. I really enjoyed it.
Once again, a big thank you to our guest, Richard Spence. Now, in other stories, here's the fourth and final part of our mini-series on the folklore of eye colours. This week, it's the turn of hazel-coloured eyes. They are more common than green, but less common than brown, and so those with hazel eyes are said to have semi-rare eyes. Hazel eyes tend to reflect the colours of their environment, appearing more green, brown or even blue indoor and in outdoor light. Several studies have been performed to delve deeper into the realm of eye colour. One study suggests that 74% of hazel eyes appear to have a brown ring around the pupil. People with hazel eyes are often very welcoming and easily approachable. They are independent, believed to be a bit mischievous, and can be somewhat unpredictable, but usually in a fun way. Yes. In addition, those with hazel eyes are sweet-natured, manly and patient. Hesitation is rarely displayed at the idea of trying something new, as these individuals readily welcome challenges. Hazel-eyed people tend to make great friends and partners, as the majority are very thoughtful and faithful individuals. So there. Big up for hazel-eyed people.
England, home to zombies, werewolves, green-skinned fairy folk? And how about dragons, strange monoliths and vampires? If you're fascinated by the bizarre and unexplained, join Charles on a road trip around the newly discovered walled Newton Triangle, where fact is much weirder than any fiction. Check out Charles Christian's fantastic Kindle book, A Travel Guide to Yorkshire's Weird Wolds, on amazon.co.uk and amazon.com. You're listening to the Weird Tales radio show with Charles Christian.
Some of you may be aware that along with the Weird Tales radio show, I also host a music show called the Americana Music Radio Show. Now, the other week we were running a feature on cover versions, and one of the tracks was a cover of the Phil Collins song In the Air Tonight, which was a debut single by Phil Collins in 1981 when his band Genesis were on hiatus. But did you know there's an urban legend associated with this song? It stems from these lines in the song. Well, if you told me you were drowning, I would not lend a hand. I've seen your face before, my friend, but I don't know if you know who I am. Well, I was there and I saw what you did. I saw it with my own two eyes. So you can wipe off that grin. I know where you've been. It's all been a pack of lies. Apologies for Phil Collins, who's spinning in his box of money. Now, Collins says the song was written in the aftermath of his divorce from his first wife. Commenting in an interview in Rolling Stone magazine 5 years ago, he said, I wrote the lyrics spontaneously. I'm not sure what that song is about, but there's a lot of anger, a lot of despair, and a lot of frustration. Fair enough. Except the urban legend has grown up that the lyrics are actually based on a drowning incident in which someone who was close enough to save the victim did not help them, while Collins, who was too far away to help, looked on. Increasingly embellished variations of the legend have emerged over time. It is nearly now 40 years, with the stories often culminating in that Collins singles out the guilty party while singing the song at a concert. So there you go. The urban legend has also been referenced by Eminem in his song Stan, in which he says, you know, that song by Phil Collins, In the Air Tonight, about that guy who could have saved that other guy from drowning, but didn't. Then Phil saw it all. Then at a show he found him. And it's also featured in the Family Guy cartoon series in the episode called The Peter Principle. Phil Collins, it should be noted, has consistently denied the song was about a real-life drowning, and he's also consistently denied another urban legend associated with him, that he divorced his second wife by sending her a fax message. He did divorce his second wife, and he did say there were some fax exchanges, also an exchange of some £17 million in settlement. There is, however, a dark side to the In the Air Tonight saga, because although the song quickly shot up the singles chart in 1981, reaching the number 2 spot, it was kept off the top spot by the posthumous release of John Lennon's single Woman, which came out following Lennon being shot dead by Mark Chapman. Incidentally, if you're keeping track here, Phil Collins divorced his third wife in 2006, and he paid her £25 million, which at the time was the largest settlement ever in a British celebrity divorce. Now for a bit of medieval law. That's legal laws distinct from folklore. And you can find the full story by Carissa Harris on the narratively.com history site. Apparently, back in the Middle Ages, one of the few grounds on which a woman could obtain a divorce was her husband's impotence. That's because the Roman Catholic Church at the time believed spouses owed a marital debt of sex to one another. But how could courts be certain that the parties were telling the truth? The answer was they called in third-party witnesses, both men and women, who would be able to provide evidence as to whether or not the man could or could not get it up. This evidence not only included people being present watching the couple trying to have sex. Clearly people in medieval times took a different perspective on personal privacy, but also female acquaintances and even local sex workers, though in those days they would have been called harlots and strumpets, who may have been present to give the poor man a hand, so as to speak. It was apparently advised that the women who are helping should warm their hands. Now, Guy de Chauliac, an influential physician and noted medical authority of the time, recommended that impotence be treated with spices, concoctions of spiced and sweetened wine, hot oils, and vigorous rubbing in front of a fire made of wood chips. I leave you to your own imagination as to what you vigorously rub. He noted that doctors were often commissioned as expert witnesses in divorce cases and suggested that they examine the generative members of the accused man carefully before ordering him to go to bed with a sexually experienced woman and then interviewing her afterwards. A whole different world. If you think that approach to justice was a bit stiff, or not as the case may be, it's worth noting that even today male impotence is grounds for a divorce in the US states of Tennessee, Mississippi, Arkansas, Massachusetts, Alabama, Oklahoma and Georgia, although courts now accept medical reports rather than require testimony from eyewitnesses. We've had a lot of fun over the last couple of weeks, Janie and I, looking at Claude Lecouteux's Dictionary of Ancient Magic Words and Spells, mainly from the Middle Ages to the early modern period, and frankly some of them are a little on the barking side, including one we're going to have in the next section, which is a spell to make everybody get up and dance. But not in a good way. This is to deal with a nosebleed. And you write the spell, Baro, Barto, Barta, Salama, on a piece of paper. And then you stick it up your nose.
They had one bit right there, didn't they?
Well, exactly.
Well, they may have had both bits right, but, certainly the paper up the nose is going to help, isn't it?
Yes. Yes, you do think that that's one sort of a problem with the causation.
Anyway,
okay,
yeah. They did their best.
They did. And here's another one for winning at cards. And to win at cards, one must first write these letters on your right hand. The letters are BRODLY. In your own blood. I can't help think that if you turn up at a card party with those letters dripping in blood on your hand, possibly people will
let you win. Basically, we're scared. We're scared of you, yeah. And there's millions more.
We'll just have one little final one in this session here. And this is a strange one. It appears to be quite a thing in Scandinavia in the 17th and 18th century. And it's a spell to set everyone in a house dancing. And
why?
There's several versions of it, but this one is you say the words, you actually write them on an aspen leaf.
Okay.
And then you place it beneath the threshold of the house and you write on it Elon, Agron, Grammaton. I say it crops up so many times there is a suspicion that perhaps dancing doesn't actually mean dancing a song, but dancing to your tune.
That makes more sense.
Commands.
Yeah. Because otherwise you could just put on, anything by the Rolling Stones. Everybody get up.
Well,
dance
exactly. Yes. Well, they would do if you'd invented a record player. Yes. Thank you, JD.
See you later.
Bye now.
Good day, gentlefolk. I doth have breaking news. Your Weird Tales host, Charles Christian, has written a new book called Saints and Sinners in Dark Age England. 5 shocking true tales that are stranger than fiction. There's murder, mayhem, treason, incest, adultery, and worse. Read about the real antics of 9 saints. Yes, saints, 8 kings and 5 queens of England, plus the wickedest of all stepmothers. And be amazed, or horrified, or appalled, or all 3. If you love weird history, and methinks you do, Hop over to Amazon for your copy of Charles Christian's Saints and Sinners in Dark Age England. Grab yours now.
Now, earlier this month, we had the feast day of St. Malachy, an Irish saint and one-time Archbishop of Armagh. He died just under 900 years ago in 1148 AD. All reports suggest St. Malachy was a thoroughly nice, caring and devout bloke and a credit to his religion. Except that St. Malachy's name has now become associated with something called the Prophecy of the Popes, which predicts that from St. Malachy's time onwards there would be just 112 more popes before the end of days and the Last Judgment. It is claimed that a Benedictine monk and historian called Arnold de Wyan discovered and published St. Malachy's doomsday prophecy in 1590, which you'll note is about 450 years after St. Malachy himself died. It's widely believed the prophecy is a 16th century hoax, possibly spread by supporters of the Italian Cardinal Simoncelli, whose supporters wanted him to become the next pope, by using the prophecy to demonstrate that Simoncelli was destined to be the pope. The plot didn't succeed, and Simoncelli did not become the pope. Now, the biggest problem with the prophecy of the popes, which contains cryptic verses about all 112 popes, is that while they are all reasonably accurate at covering the popes from St. Malachy's time to 1590, they become decidedly woolly and inaccurate after that date. In other words, it tends to suggest that in 1590 the person writing the prophecy was making the stuff up. Anyway, why mention it now? Well, apart from the fact we've just had St. Malachy's anniversary, if we slot in all the popes we've had since the year 1590, the current pope, Pope Francis, is the 112th and presumably the last pope on the list before the apocalypse. You have been warned. The end is nigh. And it is also for me. We're out of time. Now it just remains for me to say, this is Charles Christian saying, thank you for listening in. Please join me again next week. Until then, stay well, stay weird. Goodbye.
Black Shuck, the demon dog of East Anglia, is baying at the moon, which means it's time for us to go. You've been listening to the Weird Tales radio show with Charles Christian, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, witchcraft, magic and folklore. You can keep in touch with us online at www.weirdtalesradio.com, by email to weirdtales@icloud.com, and on Twitter @ChristianUncut. Join us again next week for another edition of the Weird Tales radio show. Good night.